This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. Hello everyone and welcome back to Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast. Wow, you just heard all of that in the intro. My name's Michael Connolly and I'll be your host for this episode. Joining me again is Steve Connolly. G'day Steve, how you doing?
Hello, Michael. Hello, all. I'm really well, thanks. Yes. Gosh, I'm enjoying being back on the podcast chair regularly and having...
What's a podcast chair look like, Steve? Does it look like any normal chair except you got headphones on and have a microphone in front of your face? Back on the podcast chair.
Oh, I did. You know, when you're halfway through saying something and I was going to say on the podcast wagon. I'm really glad.
Is there a 12-step process for that wagon, Steve?
I'm really enjoying having regular discussions with you and recording those discussions for our podcast.
Okay, I'll pay that one. That was good. Oh, it's great. And look, it is really good to be having these discussions because sometimes things come up, like obviously last time when we were talking about the weather. And I'm happy to report that despite a wicked storm that flew over southeast Queensland again yesterday, we have had some good weather that has helped the cleanup, which is really good to know. And one of the comments that somebody had made that I saw on social media this week was it's great to see the volunteer spirit just go, wow, when you get activities being able to be pulled together in response to flood events like this.
It certainly is. Yeah, I was actually talking with someone from a state sporting organisation who had made the comment that, you know, you'll often see the best brought out in people when things like this happen, and you know, volunteers are rolling up their sleeves and helping out their neighbours and you know, and the sporting organisations in their area. And we agreed that it's interesting that it often takes something like this for people to volunteer. People have obviously got it in them and want to help out when there's a need for it. So maybe there's something to learn from that clubs out there that are needing volunteer support could be better at educating their local community that they need that support on a regular basis, not just, you know, in isolated incidents of disaster.
Yeah, and an interest. So that's the volunteer side. The other side is people's generosity, and there's obviously ways that people can give and you and I have seen this firsthand with our brother whose house this time was spared, but last time was really badly damaged in the flood. And even through that, they saw that there were people far worse off than them, and their generosity just came out and they were able to donate funds to help other people through the floods. So if you are interested in donating funds, then there are plenty of opportunities for you to do so. I'm sure a Google search for how to do so would pretty easily help you come across somebody who needs help. But I'd actually suggest, if you are interested in donating funds to help in any of the flood recovery efforts, find somebody directly. Just find a club that you would like to directly donate to and make the donation directly to them. In most cases, a donation to sport from an individual won't be tax deductible in Australia, but notwithstanding, it's still a good way that will help the flood recovery, especially for those clubs that are in low-lying ground where it's not actually possible to get flood insurance. And look, we do have a great system of government here where the state is going to come to the party to help restore a lot of the, if not all of the sporting assets, and councils are already well and truly on the way. Everything from helping with the cleanup efforts through to helping reinstate facilities. So that's really positive and good to see. So good to see the money, good to see the council support, good to see the government support, and of course, good to see the volunteering as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And back into the podcast discussion then about you being back on your podcast chair. Something interesting came up this week, Steve, that I want to have a quick chat about, and that is back to meetings. Now, I know that we've done quite a bit about meetings, but this came up in the context of redoing a constitution for a football club. And somebody asked a really interesting question. It was, you know, we got to that part about meetings, and there's two parts in a constitution about meetings, one about meetings of the committee or the board, and the other one about meetings of members. But the question that came up was, you know, when we're sitting in meetings and somebody says something and then somebody else seconds it, why do we second things? What does seconding it even mean? And I was thinking, obviously at the time, it was cool. There are some people who are interested in meetings. I got my nerd hat on and went, yes, let's talk about some meetings things. But I think,
and then they promptly regretted showing interest in.
No, because they came back with another question. So
Okay.
I'm going to assume that they enjoyed the answer so much that we got to have another crack. Anyway, so Steve, I'm going to let you talk us through the typical process for the way that a motion should start and get to the resolution. And before we do, though, it's important to understand what a motion is. It's not like a bowel motion that you want to move on the floor of a meeting or tabling your motion. That's not okay. And
I don't know how many times that's happened.
I've
really got the shits with someone else.
Shits in a meeting. Oh. Anyway, back on track. Thanks for derailing my train of thought there, Steve. So what is a motion? The simplest way to define what a motion is the decision that the person who moves the motion wants the meeting to make. So the example that we use quite often, and I think we may have used this in one of our meetings podcasts early in the piece, was if I want to buy a new barbecue, I want the club to buy a new barbecue because the one that we've got shagged and rusty burners and the plates falling apart, then I would write the decision that I want made and present that. So rather than just writing barbecue on the agenda, we would write, and if we were to do it right, that the club purchase a new barbecue up to the value of $700 from an appropriate provider. And you could name that provider if you've got a preferred quote. And then you can attach the quotes and everything so that by the time you get to the meeting, what I'm asking you as my fellow committee member to decide is black and white. It's really clear what we're talking about at the beginning of the conversation, because otherwise you talk around in circles for half an hour and then the president or the chair of the meeting falling asleep says, can we pull it to a motion? Which I always found funny because it's kind of like, well, we've been talking about something for half an hour and now we're going to decide what we've been talking about. So rather than wasting time with wishy-washy topics or words, we say, this is the decision that we want made, and that goes on the agenda as a motion. Motions can come up through procedurally through the meeting, though. So when the treasurer presents their report, for instance, the motion is that the treasurer's report be received and adopted. When the minutes of the previous meeting are moved, the motion is that the minutes of the previous meeting be accepted as a true and correct record of that meeting. So that's the decision. I want this group to decide that these minutes are correct. I want this group to decide that this financial statement that's been presented to us is fair and accurate, and we're going to adopt it. I want this group to agree that we're going to buy the barbecue. So they can be one-off things like the barbecue. They can be procedural as things that come up in the meeting, or they can be any other decision. So in a discussion, you might say, well, hang on a minute, that's a really good idea. Let's agree that we're going to change from having oranges at halftime to having pink grapefruit at halftime. I'm spitballing there, and I hope that's not the sort of
what
thing.
What a nice idea. I need a bit of sugar to just drizzle.
Depends on the season. The pink grapefruits when they're in season are just anyway. Back to not like a navel orange with the sugar.
Okay,
and maybe that's why they're having that decision. Right.
So, do you want me to carry on with your answer that you already started to provide for yourself?
No, right. Yes, please do. No, I was only explaining what a motion is. Now I'm going to let you.
A space motion, not E motion.
Yes. Thank you.
So I think one of the really important points that you started to touch on there is the clarity of the wording of the motion itself, which, yes, as we tout, should be a decision-based sentence beginning with the word that. But the motion itself shouldn't ideally be heard or seen for the first time by attendees during the meeting. We talk a lot about the meeting procedure formality falling somewhere on a spectrum, and at one end of the spectrum you've got no agenda and people turning up late and no minutes and really just sitting around and having a chat, and at the other end you've got formal parliamentary procedure. And most clubs fall somewhere around the middle of that spectrum, but regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, it's important to recognize that the better you prepare, the more efficient and the more effective. I didn't say efficient and effective there. The more efficient and the more effective your meetings will be. So ideally, if someone has a decision that they want the committee or board to make, someone from that committee, they should get that motion on the agenda before the meeting so that their proposed decision and everyone else's proposed decision can be considered by attendees before the meeting even starts. So ideally, sometime days or a week out from the meeting, ideally, we've got a motion on notice that goes to the secretary, and the secretary adds all of those motions onto the agenda, very clearly worded as proposed decisions, that then goes out to all attendees on the agenda, let's say a day or 3 days before the meeting itself. So everyone can read the agenda and have a really good idea of exactly what decisions each attendee wants made at that meeting. Now, this is, as you say, in contrast to what happens at most meetings in our experience, where there's discussion that goes around in circles for, yes, up to half an hour or more in some instances. And then the poor chairperson says, can we pull that to a motion? And we haven't even had clarity as to what we're actually discussing. So getting the motion process right from the outset should include, addition of motions to the agenda. They're listed against the person who has provided the motion or notice to the secretary. That person ideally then moves the motion at the meeting, and someone else seconds it. Now, this is really interesting. And if, in the context of that question that you had asked of you, if no one seconds a motion, what happens?
The motion lapses.
The motion lapses for want of a seconder. And all we can assume is that there's only one person who wants that decision made, so much so that no one else even seconded the motion. So we move on. We strike that item from the minutes. It doesn't get recorded, or, there might be a note made that the motion lapsed for want of a seconder, and we go on to the next motion.
So in my experience, when that happens, it's typically not the first time that motion has been raised. So in standing orders, which means the rules of meetings, if a motion is moved and seconded, and then the vote is then put, and the motion is not carried, so it's lost, then that's it. You can't bring it up again at that meeting. But it might come up again at a subsequent meeting. And at that point, that's when everybody says, well, hang on a minute, we've already had this debate. The motion was lost. Therefore, you're bringing it up again because you can. But everyone else says, well, we don't want to have the discussion again, so nobody seconds it. And that's when it then lapses for want of a seconder.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. I think that it's less likely that the first time something is discussed, someone who wants a decision made won't find at least one other person to second their motion.
Yeah. So what you're saying, it sounds like, is that for somebody to second a motion, they're saying, yes, I want to have the debate.
Yes, that's right. Not even necessarily, yes, I agree with this proposed decision and I'm even necessarily going to vote in favor. Yes, I agree with having the debate, which is where we then go. So after the motion's seconded, we enter debate, and there are rules, and again, there's a spectrum of formality as to how structured that debate might be. In most clubs, we have an open discussion. There's not a process at least the committee meeting level. There's not necessarily a great degree of formality applied by the chairperson in managing debate, for instance, ensuring that we've got someone speaking for and someone speaking against the motion, in alternate order. And then once we've got a couple of people who've spoken for or against, the chair will typically say, all right, well, obviously there's no one to argue for the other side, so let's put this to the vote. But often that seems like we're turning, and we've spoken about this in the past, it seems like we're turning most clubs' meeting procedure on its head, where there is just more typically general discussion, and then we say, all right, well, does everyone agree? Yep, great, let's move on to the next discussion point. And it's difficult in those instances for the secretary to actually make a formal note or enter into the minutes the record of the decision that was made, because we don't have a clearly based decision, clearly worded decision-based sentence in the way of a motion. So this makes the secretary's job a whole lot easier by getting in words written down on a screen or on paper exactly the decision that someone wants made, exactly the decision that someone else agrees, yes, let's discuss and debate this. And then once the decision's made, if there's no amendment to the motion, all the secretary has to do is write carried or lost.
Yeah. So there's a couple of important points in there, Steve. The first one that I like is that the secretary's job is not to make assumptions. The secretary shouldn't have to assume what somebody says. And this is at every point of the meeting process. So when somebody says, hey, can you put barbecue on the agenda? The secretary can say, no, because I would need to make an assumption as to what you actually want on the agenda. What's the decision?
Yes.
So don't just accept shitty motions or shitty topics to go on the agenda. If there's a decision that sits behind it, get that and don't make any assumptions. Same during the meeting. It's the president and the secretary's job to run the meeting in tandem as like a pilot and a navigator. So if the secretary doesn't have the clear wording of the motion at the beginning, it's the chair's job to say, oh, slow down. Let's make sure that the wording here is properly captured in the minutes, captured by the secretary for the minutes before we move on. The other one is where you said about the voting, and voting by consensus, it is okay. So if you don't actually get to the point which you're getting to about having the vote, if its motion is moved, motion is seconded, and the chair says, is everyone happy with that? And everyone goes, yep. Then it's carried unanimously. So in that case, the secretary can record that the motion was carried unanimously, even though an actual show of hands or voting by any other means wasn't taken.
And that's most common, isn't it? Really,
at this level,
at the committee level, committee meeting level as well. So yes, at this level of most of our listeners are in clubs and associations where decision making by consensus, certainly at the board meeting, is logical. More so when we enter into the realm of general meetings, annual general meetings, particularly if we're making big decisions like changing our name, adopting a new constitution and so on, which might need a special resolution, then we need to be confirming that we're actually achieving the required 75% majority rather than just simple majority of those people present and voting. So we actually do need to count votes. So you've got to get your hands in the air or vote one way or another in your secret ballot form.
And that demonstrates that the one organisation can be at multiple points on that continuum of complexity of meeting processes as well. So for those decisions that need, yes, we absolutely need to know the numbers here, then they can move to the more sophisticated end of the continuum. But for the day-to-day decisions that they're making as a committee at this time of year for the winter sports, for instance, probably weekly or fortnightly, but then into probably into their monthly meeting frequency as the season then ramps up. They can be, if everyone's on the same page and we're having regular discussions between meetings, so we are all on the same page and we're getting to the meeting, the purpose of the meeting, make the decision, that decision then leads to action.
Yeah. I think one of the really important points in the context of the discussion that we're having today is that meetings are the way that organizations make decisions. So it's important that the minutes of those meetings reflect the decisions that were made at them. And by creating a clearly worded motion, there's no confusion. There can be no confusion around what decision was made, because the motion that is worded, that the club purchase a new barbecue up to the value of X from a preferred supplier carried, it's really easy for a reader, subsequently down the track to read the minutes of a meeting and to very easily identify what decision was made. Whereas if there's a lot of discussion that was going, and a lot of minutes that we look at are a record of the discussion rather than a record of the decisions. And
or a record of the
shortcoming.
Yeah, a record of the discussion that happened that then led us to decide what we were talking about and then make a decision, which was, well, we don't have enough information, so go and get some quotes or go and get some more information and come back next time, which is so limp. Just on the wording, though, we've just rattled off some very formal wording of motions, and that's because we're fairly well practiced at it, being meeting nerds. But in writing your motions, don't get too hung up on how you write them. You don't need to necessarily learn how to write a formal motion. Just think about it. What's the decision I want made? How can I write that decision in a way that gives everyone perfect clarity and removes ambiguity about what it is that I want you to decide? Because from that decision, we can then determine a course of action, which is somebody's going to now go and do something, or somebodies are going to go and do some things to put that decision into action. So one example that I wanted to give was an interesting situation that arose. This is probably going back 15, 16 years now. And it was in a hockey club. Now, for some reason, we talk about the separation of governance and operations, and that the governance people are the ones who are typically sitting on the committee, and that's where they're, as volunteers, that's where they can give the most or feel that they can give the most, and therefore, obviously, they're getting the most out of their volunteer time. Those on-the-field volunteers are more operational, and it's when you blur the lines between operations and governance that governance typically suffers, because it's the bit that drops off the bottom when things get busy. So when there's fires to fight, when there's urgency, when there's uniforms and merchandise to order, when there's a season to run, typically it's the governance that falls off the bottom. So that's why straddling is not a good idea. Anyway, in this case, we had the senior coach, the senior men's team coach, on the committee. Now, that's an interesting decision, but we'll leave that for another, to have that operational position on the committee, but we'll leave that to the side. It plays into this story a little bit because of the motion that was put on the agenda. And I use the term motion here extremely loosely because it wasn't. The topic that he had put on the agenda was, I think the wording was Senior Men's Awards Night or something to that effect. And what he actually wanted was the club to invest $400 and something at the time in sending him and the captain and maybe one or two others to this senior awards night, aka hockey piss up. So now it's fine. Go have fun. I'm all for awards nights, and I'm all for having fun to do with sport. Should the club pay for that though? And that was, and why it had come up is, well, that's what we've always done. The club has always funded this many people to go. Now, despite the fact that that's putting the not-for-profit nature of a club in question, because not-for-profit means that the members can't share in the surplus assets. So should they really be going on a junket on the club's coin? That's questionable. So the concerns that I'm expressing to you now were felt by the treasurer, who was new at this time, but it was one of those volunteers that fell into step. So when you see how things have always been done, you just adopt that culturally and you keep operating in the same way. Now, she felt very uncomfortable about this decision. She didn't know that there's this whole meeting procedure that means that if we put this to the vote, she has a chance to publicly, at least in the context of the committee, say, no, I don't support this idea. I don't agree that it's the right sort of decision, and to have that recorded. She just thought that, well, old mates put it on the agenda, so we have to fund it, don't we? So I explained to this group at this time, which was a little awkward, obviously, because the head coach, who was really looking forward to his annual piss up on the club money, was in the room when I was explaining, you don't have to agree. Just because somebody's put that on the agenda, okay, you can second it, which means exactly as you've said, I want to have the discussion. But when it comes time to make the decision, everyone gets to put their hand up in the air to say, yes, I want to spend the $400, or no, I don't want to agree to spending the $400. So look, in this case, the club spent the $400 for no good reason, only for the bad reason that I think made it into Basket Case Club's episode 1. We do it like that because that's how we've always done it. But the treasurer in this case was able to say, I'm not comfortable with this and I don't think it's a good idea. And then a subsequent note went in the minutes to say, this should be reviewed before the same thing comes up next year. Now, unfortunately, I didn't see what happened the next year, but at least we'd moved from this just happens because it's always happened to actually we need to have a critical think about this each time. And I made it perfectly clear that I didn't think it was a good idea, as did the treasurer. So if nothing else has happened, they've opened up the ability to have that discussion. In subsequent years, the right thing for that committee to do was to say, well, it's fine for me to sit here in my podcast chair and say ivory tower podcast chair and say, this is what I think. It is ultimately up to that club to make the decision, but this sort of information about, hey, remember what not-for-profit means, and hey, remember you've got an ability to actually say you don't support this, and for crying out loud, have an informed discussion in your decision-making process. So to wrap up then, Steve, what's interesting is that you don't need to second motions. They're part of these standing orders that most clubs have adopted without even knowing it. So remember, standing orders mean the rules for meetings, and they exist in there. But those standing orders can get, as you say, with full parliamentary procedure, they can get very complex and sophisticated, or they can be really simple. So seconding a motion is actually part of standing orders, not part of your constitution. It doesn't say in your constitution you must move a motion and then have that motion seconded. So for really simple decisions, it's actually okay if you don't. But is it okay? It's legally okay, but from a best practice governance principles, is it okay? And I think not. I think the best bet is, here's the decision that I want to make. Does somebody else at least want to have that discussion? Then yes, then that's the seconding. Then we have the discussion and debate with some structure around it. This level of complexity of that structure dependent on the level of complexity of the decision. And then let's now see who wants to go ahead, vote yes, or who wants to say no. And we actually put it to the vote.
Excellent. And I think as a little additional takeaway. You made a comment that some motions that might come to the secretary are, poorly worded, or in your terms, shitty motions. So the takeaway that I wanted to leave with our listeners today is don't accept bowel motions. All you secretaries out there, don't accept bowel motions. And even if there's no one seconding the motion, as we've touched on, at a very high level today, simply wording the motion, with ideally worded beginning with the word that, because that really forces you to write a decision-based sentence, makes it very easy for the secretary to document that decision, and easy for people reflecting on the minutes, on the decisions made through review of the minutes, to see exactly what the committee or the members at a general meeting made. So even if you are more on the lenient end of, closer to the lenient end of the meeting procedure formality spectrum, it's vital that your minutes reflect the decisions that were made at your minutes. So in a lot of cases, shorter, more succinct minutes are better than, lengthy verbose minutes that don't clearly document the decisions made. If they just, are a verbatim note of everything that everyone said, it's going to be really hard to go through there and pluck out the decisions that were actually made.
Yep. And that's very boring for new people joining a committee, to be reading 20-page minutes of he said, she said stuff that in some cases is important, but when the decision is oranges or pink grapefruit, you probably don't need 3 pages of crap.
No, that's a very good point. The other thing that came to mind as we've been having this discussion is that often minutes are a good way to kind of squash arguments as they rear their head. So you might have people trying to, make a case that a decision wasn't made properly. And even though a lot of constitutions say, even if you, deviate from standing orders, or you deviate from some step in the process, or some step in the process, and, that doesn't mean that a decision that you've made is invalid purely by virtue of missing a step in the process.
That wasn't discovered until after the decision had been made.
Thank you. That wasn't discovered until subsequently. Even though that's the case, you might have people who try and mount an argument against a decision that's made because of some deviation from process. So it's important, again, that we've got a really clearly documented decision so that we can point to that and say, no, the decision was made at the meeting and here's the proof of that decision.
Yeah. Yep. So takeaway 1, move motions, have them properly worded, but not shitty bowel motions. Number 2, have those motions seconded before you get into the discussion and the debate. Number 3, have the discussion and debate. Number 4, make the decision. Is it yes or is it no? And then, most importantly, number 5, go and put it into action and write those actions down clearly with who's going to do it and by when, and if there's a cost associated to it. Really simple action plan.
Good. 5-step process, not 12.
Yeah. So thank you to all of our listeners who've been sending in ideas. Please keep them coming. If you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, make sure you do that. Go to cprgroup.com.au, scroll to the bottom of the homepage, and a little pop-up will come up enabling you to sign up straight from there. Follow us on social media, where we've got always have some interesting bits and pieces going out. And of course, as always, thank you to Jess, our wonderful producer and editor, for making all of our jokes that are included in the podcast only the good ones. And if you think that they're not good jokes that are in the podcast, imagine what the outtake reel sounds like. Steve, thank you again for joining me on this discussion about moving good motions and having them seconded before going to a vote. I look forward to catching up with you again next time.
As will I. Thank you, Mick. Bye.
Bye.